Lorianne, thank you for joining us. Let's kind of talk about the cross-Atlantic port problem, and bottlenecks in Europe mean bottlenecks here in the U.S.
It definitely does. I mean, all the pipes are connected within the world. And so, what we're seeing is with these port strikes, as well as the lower volumes of water, we are seeing that there is at least a 2.5 month delay of containers coming into the United States. And what that means is that, not only are we getting our imports late, this also impacts the availability of empty containers that are going back to Asia. And while we're very US focused here, of course, because we're in the United States, the European Asia trade is the largest in the world because of the amount of the mega ships, right, that go into their ports. And as of right now, I've spoken with some ocean carriers, there are 2/3 more containers waiting to get into Europe than the whole US East Coast combined.
Yeah, so Lori, welcome to the show. This is a really interesting topic. We've been talking about this or anticipating an issue that may occur with bottlenecks there, and now it's hitting home. The issue, so you got volumes that are kind of dropping, right? From at least from China over this way through on the Pacific. Is that the same coming in this route here, and it's just purely the bottlenecks, or is there a volume increase because of the change in routing, or what is causing these bottlenecks? Because you've got a bottleneck on the East Coast and in Europe, right? So kind of two different choke points.
Yeah, you've got two different choke points coming in. So what happens is, remember, we've got all these pipes that are interconnected. Mm-hmm. So the pipe from Europe to the East Coast, that pipe itself is about 2.5 months behind because you've had so many labor stoppages and the port strikes, so to speak, as well as their rail strikes. They've had rail strikes. So that has delayed European exports from coming in. Now, on the flip side, from Asia to China, as we all know, and we've talked about this before, we are seeing more trade come in from Asia to the East Coast rather than the West Coast because of, congestion on the West Coast, as well as logistics managers fearing, of course, of a labor strike. So it's really it's like a congestion contagion, so to speak, where you've got the East Coast now facing a flurry of containers that are congested from both sides of the world, so to speak.
So that's talking about the import side of things. What about the exports coming out of the United States and headed into Europe? Are they facing the same issues as well?
They are, because it's the lack of manpower over in Europe. They don't have enough people. And so they're also deliberately working slower. So you have this delay where you have, thousands upon thousands of, TEUs waiting to get in. The problem also is inland. So because the rail has been backed up for so long, at one point, like one ocean carrier was waiting on 200 containers and they were landlocked. So it's a conundrum of sorts where both the U.S. and Asia are waiting to have their products being unloaded.
Yeah, so we're in another conundrum here, and we've got backed up ports, and we've got two different choke points, and we've got the choke point still on the West Coast, and you've got ships coming through the Panama, and then when we talk to different ports, like the port of Boston, mm-hmm. It's actually faster coming through the Suez to get to that point, right? So does that change the flow through the Suez to the East Coast direct or through, how does this affect the flow moving forward? Because we've kind of had this, but we're investing so much in the infrastructure on the East Coast, right? And how much is that going to grab and keep mm-hmm. that West Coast freight on the East Coast? Does this kind of push it back the other way because of this congestion?
Not really, because trade is sticky. So as you know, through the years, the East Coast and the Gulf have increased their market share, if you will, of trade. And you've seen the decline, if you will, the West Coast in terms of market share. I spoke with Norfolk Southern last week because I was reporting on how Hapag-Lloyd they're now avoiding the West Coast, and they're going through that port of Virginia, and they're using a rail line to move their containers, and then they go to Chicago, and then they ship them back to the West Coast because it's faster. And so you really are seeing this energy and excitement, if you will, within the transports about this higher influx of trade. And it's going to stick because when you look at the other side, it's just a lot worse. You have more alternatives on the East Coast to move your trade.
Those alternatives are something that's important to think about, especially when you talk about it geographically, right? The West Coast ports are fairly spread out along that coast, or at least once you get out of the San Pedro Bay Area. They're pretty spread out. It takes a lot of effort to get them across the wide West, but when you're on the East Coast, you're closer to those population centers. I feel like you also have a little bit more accessibility to that manpower as well on the East Coast. And we all know that the ILWU issues are going on the West Coast, but is there any type of inclination of labor problems or work problems with workers on the East Coast at all? Is that something people need to be concerned about?
Not from what I have heard. Thankfully. In terms of that, I mean, the biggest thing that we're all going to be looking at, and we're going to be talking about increasingly, of course, is the possible threat of a railroad strike in September. So that's going to be the big thing. And that by far, everyone that I've spoken with said that heaven forbid that happens, a railroad strike would be far more damaging to the U.S. supply chain and the world of trade compared to the strike of an ILWU.
It's really interesting that you mentioned, the plans and what Hapag-Lloyd is doing, right? Coming into the East Coast, into Chicago, and then out the West Coast with empties, right? Because isn't that one of the things really that caused a lot of this congestion? Is that a port is a two-way street? It's a valve that goes basically both ways, and if you had that circular kind of motion, it would kind of help things a little bit. So, are we accidentally stumbling on a better circular system to get to the middle of the United States?
As of now, we are, because the rail system, Norfolk, when it comes to that feeder part for the rails, I guess it's faster from Chicago to, say, LA than from, say, LA to Chicago. I mean, look at that rail dwell time over at the ports of LA and Long Beach. I mean, it's ticked down slightly. But it is indeed a lot faster. And I think about a year ago, I was on, talking to you about where Gene Soroka from the Port of LA told me he was telling the ocean carriers, stop sending your empty containers back to the West Coast. Because remember, at one point, they were sending their empty containers back to the West Coast to get back to Asia so they could be filled up. So in some ways, it's a faster way.
And then, of course, when we talk about cost in these types of situations, time is one thing, but money is also the other thing. Can you talk a little bit about maybe kind of rates coming over from Europe to the US right now, and then what they're losing in money versus time? Same thing coming from the west to the east and making that circular trip. What is kind of their cost benefit and money spent versus time gained there?
Well, the whole thing is, and we've talked about this, a vessel at rest is not making money in terms of the importer. So whereas, on the East Coast, the rates have kind of held firm, right, in terms of the 9,200 to 9,500, whereas the West Coast is continuing to drop. I mean, it dropped slightly from 6,500 to 6,200 FEU. Over the course of the week. With Europe, it's held steady because, remember, congestion holds the pricing. And so also with the blank sailings, you are seeing an increase in blank sailings in Europe, as well as now you're seeing stuff in the East Coast because, vessel schedule is only 30%, right? So the ocean carriers are trying to make up time. Between the blank sailings and the congestion in terms of getting the container over, it's going to hold those rates. It's not going to drop where we were all hoping the spot rate would continue to drop. It's just not going to now.
Yeah. So, Lori-Ann, where does this put your expectations now for the rest of 2022 as far as maritime is and its impact on the U.S. economy?
Well, I think it's really that bifurcation that we're seeing. I mean, if you looked at what Walmart, predicted, what they announced yesterday, rather, certain segments of the population are going to be more impacted, if you will, by inflation. We're also going to have earnings reports this week from LVMH, from Prada. So that's, of course, the other aspect of the consumer, whereas they're not impacted as much by inflation. And we've also seen with inventories, and we've talked about this before, whereas furniture and appliances, everybody bought those at the height of the pandemic because they needed, new things. Those have been pulled back. But when it comes to sportswears and certain apparel, that is still strong, and that's what I'm seeing in terms of the inventories going forward. So I think we're going to be at this new normal, so to speak, that's overused from a consumer standpoint until we start seeing more of that inventory eaten down. And I'm anticipating that's going to be probably like chiseled away by the second quarter of next year.
Lorianne, with some of these Q2 earnings reports coming in, some folks are saying that we're not expecting a traditional peak season. They're not anticipating the way peak season has been in the most recent memory. Do you think that that's kind of a good forecast, or are we still expecting to see the challenges that would come along with a typical peak season?
We're definitely going to have the challenges. I mean, when you look at it's not a quote normal peak season, nothing's been normal since 2019. And when you look at the processing and the amount of vessels that are waiting off the East Coast, how can you say that it's not going to be a dull peak season? The volumes may not be as tremendous, if you will, from last year versus year over year, but they're still very, very high. And so that's the expectations that people have to pull back on. They're still tremendous, and it's still going to take some time. When you're looking at Savannah and you see $1.2 million of trade at anchor because of the amount of containers there, no matter how great they can process. And as you know, I have that supply chain heat map that I developed with my data providers, including, of course, FreightWaves. When you look at how tremendous they are in terms of pushing out the containers, at some point, you still have 36 vessels waiting to come in. So it does slow down the process. So we are going to still see that congestion, and we're seeing that congestion now. And that's what's setting the floor on the container prices. We're not going to see this continuous drop because, as we all know, congestion creates a floor in pricing.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent stuff, Lorianne. We'll be watching what you're writing. I always do. Can't wait to catch up again. You have an excellent rest of your day. Catch your stuff out on American Shipper.
Absolutely. You can find that on AmericanShipper.com. Right now, we're going to go check out what is making headlines on FreightWaves.com with our first check of headlines.